So welcome back to week 2, lecture number 4 in our Parenting Today lecture series. We're going to talk about Belsky's parenting theory now for the next few minutes. And Belsky's parenting theory is a quite popular and research-based theory that's based on 3 main areas of influence. The first being the parental psychological resources. So we're essentially looking at the parent and the resources that they bring in to the dyad or the parent-child dynamic here. So we're going to look at the developmental history of the parent. So we're assessing that parents, the way that they were parented. So for example, was that parent parented by someone who used an authoritative parenting style, or permissive parenting style, authoritarian parenting style? So what did that parent internalize from their childhood experience? Did they have any developmental trauma happen? Were they a victim of abuse, any type of physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse? All of these factors are really important because I've worked with many parents over the years that have said, they endured a particular kind of abuse or hardship during their childhood, and they make this vow to themselves. I'm going to be different as a parent. I'm going to raise my child differently. And then that parent may work really hard to do so, but they find that the way that they were parented as a child has a very deep influence on them, and it may cause them to act out in ways that they never intended, or maybe that they did everything to avoid. So we do know, and Belsky's parenting theory points to this, that parental developmental history plays a very important role in how someone chooses to parent, or how they subconsciously parent. The parent's personality style, according to Belsky, is really most important in terms of influence. So when we look at personality types, we want to look at, is that parent primarily introverted or primarily extroverted? And sometimes we can see some problems or difficulties in communication between parent and child. Let's say when a parent is primarily extroverted and they may have a child that's introverted. So it can make that difficult for the parent and child to be able to understand one another and communicate when they have those personality conflicts or differences. The second main area of influence, according to Belsky's parenting theory, is the child characteristics. So we're going to look at the gender of the child, male or female, how they perceive themselves to be, their biological sex, huge important role here. We're also going to look at the temperament of the child. Are they a child that's slow to warm? Do they tend to be someone who is more laid back? Are they easy to anger, easy to startle? When we talk about Belsky's parenting theory, that third domain or area of influence that we want to look at is the social and environmental context. So we want to look at the sources of stress and the sources of support. So those sources of stress, whether it be economic stress, whether it be stress due to mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, those sources of stress are really risk factors for things like abuse. And we also want to look at the other side, conversely, those sources of support. So we want to look at areas that parent is receiving support from, whether that be financial support, emotional support in terms of an extended support system. And we know, research tells us that those sources of support are really protective factors when it comes to parenting. This next slide here is a nice graphic that shows Belsky's parenting theory in action here. Shows how these different factors play together. Another model is Bronfenbrenner. We'll revisit that. If you remember, we talked about Bronfenbrenner. We're talking about all those different systems and how they play together, the mesosystems, the microsystems, the exosystems. Belsky's model focuses primarily on the family unit from a psychological approach, but Bronfenbrenner takes a really broader approach, an interdisciplinary systems approach. So Bronfenbrenner's model focuses more on the environment just than on those individual psychological factors. And here's a slide similar to the one that we viewed earlier when we discussed Bronfenbrenner's systems theory here, the ecological systems theory. So key points that we want to remember here is that parenting is influenced by factors beyond the family unit. Parenting practices are heavily grounded in societal and cultural values, and that parenting changes across time, both within families and within society at large. So socialization. Remember when this class first began last week, we were talking about the primary job of parents is socialization. So teaching children the behaviors, values, and competencies that are needed to function in society. So in other words, socialization is teaching children about culture. So what is culture? It's an important definition that you'll likely see again on quizzes. A culture is the values, beliefs, ways of thinking, rituals, and institutions of a group or a population. So culture has a huge impact on parenting, and this is something that's really a taboo area. It's not something that is always discussed, but it's critical to examine. So why is culture important in parenting? Well, because it dictates what we value in society. It recommends how we should conduct ourselves to get along with society, otherwise known as socialization. And children construct a cultural scheme of the world, first from their parents and then from others. So typically peers, as children tend to reach school age, and peers become an even deeper, more significant influence as children enter those preteen and teenage years. So the components of culture are independent versus interdependent cultures, race, ethnicity, religion, social status, geography. When we talk about geography here in the United States and abroad as well, an urban culture versus a rural culture. Memberships in special groups is also a hugely important cultural component. And one of those important special groups to mention would be the military. So we talk about independent versus interdependent. There's individualistic versus collectivist societies, really differs in cultural goals. It affects how we progress through individual achievement and also strength in numbers. So an example of this, when we think about mainstream American culture, tends to be highly individualistic. So mainstream America really encourages people to promote rugged individualism, really go out and achieve, think of themselves, be very focused on achieving their individual goals. Whereas other cultures across the world tend to be more collectivist societies. So they're really thinking about what's best for the group. So we're not really thinking about, if we're a part of a collectivist society, our own individual goals. Our focus is on maintaining harmony in the group and identifying what's best for the group and promoting that collectivism as much as we can in all of our actions. So we think about independent cultures. That's where children become self-sustaining, productive adults. Independent cultures tend to value autonomy, competence, individuality, and uniqueness. And they're also more likely to use physical punishment in order to encourage children to really abide by these rules. Interdependent cultures raised children to be socially responsible, family-oriented, indulged, self-regulated and disciplined, and respectful of authority. So we think here about different developmental goals, independence and interdependence. This right here gives several examples here. We talk about the developmental trajectory. If we're going to look at that through the lens of independence, we're moving from that dependent to independent self. From the lens of interdependence, we're moving from an asocial to a socially responsible self. So that's the most important thing you want to take away from this slide today. So now we're going to move into giving a cross-cultural example of American mothers. So in terms of cultural values that are important, being economically independent, being emotionally independent, being honest and respectful of other people. Again, using this example of American mothers, parenting practices that are common here in the United States. And again, this is making a real stereotypical type of a statement. We're not saying that all American mothers embody these parenting practices. Um, Parenting process practices are that mothers feel responsible for how the child turns out. Most of a child's time is spent with a mother or alone. There's little care from others besides parents. There's free exploration in the home. Typically American mothers of today tend to believe in baby proofing the homes, whereas if we look at American mothers from yesteryears, maybe say in the 1930s, 1940s, children were expected to learn at a very young age that certain things were off limits, or children were sequestered in playpens, so they didn't have that opportunity to freely explore the environment. In a modern American culture, children tend to be on a scheduled sleep, either sleeping alone or with siblings. There's ritualized sleeping patterns such as bedtime stories and prayers. There's feeding on demand, is considered to be a mother and child activity that both benefit from. And we are going to give another example here of cross-cultural examples. Italian mothers tend to really value good health, financial security, a good family life. In terms of this example here that we're giving in regard to Italian mothers, the parenting practices, mothers don't feel responsible for how a child turns out. Children are viewed to have their own destiny, and only 10% of time is spent with mother. It's really unconcerned with independence. Children are almost never alone in a traditional Italian society. There's a heavy involvement with an extended family. Free exploration is considered unsafe. And sleeping on demand. Children typically sleep in parents' rooms. There's not really bedtime rituals. Children are just following along with the parent's schedule. And in terms of feeding on schedule, children typically eat with the family, and that's really important in socialization with Italian mothers. Going to give another cross-cultural example here of Japanese mothers. Cultural values include Confucianism, Shinto, Buddhism. There's a dependence on parents. Honoring elders is primary, and also putting others first is an important part of mainstream Japanese culture. In the Shinto belief, children under the age of 7 belong to the gods, so it's viewed that children are revered and indulged, so they're happy and don't return to the gods prematurely. Children are taught to be responsive to the needs of others and to conform to society. According to this belief, going along with this belief, around the age of 7, children come into what's known as the age of understanding. So discipline becomes stricter, but anger is rarely displayed. There's an emphasis on explaining consequences and the need for self-restraint. The importance for grandmothers is also high and valued. There's also communal practices that are put into place, and these communal practices include, but aren't limited to, co-sleeping and community baths. And independence is not something that's really encouraged, and it's also even punished. So in our next series here, our next part in the series, we're going to continue the discussion by focusing on culture diversity in the U.S. So I look forward to seeing you in our next part of the lecture.